The last empire of Iran is a political and military history of the Sasanian Empire. I wrote this book to fill a gap. So far, we've only had 3 works on the Sassanian state to refer to. The first of these is not very useful anymore. It was published in the late 19th century by a man by the name of Rawlinson. It's called The Seventh Great Oriental Monarchy, from the year 1870. Apart from that, we have Arthur Christensen's L'Iran sous les Sassanides, published in 1936, and Touraj Daryai's Sassanian Persia from 2008. Both very fine books. But it seemed to me that there was more than enough room for another one, at least for the sake of variety. But I also wanted to correct a bias. I believe that the study of late antiquity is unfairly dominated by the history of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Greco-Roman world. Both very interesting and important subjects in their own right. I myself was once a classicist. But for the fullest understanding of the period in question, we cannot neglect the only world power that Rome acknowledged as an equal, which eventually subjugated a great deal of the Roman Empire, and which cast such a long shadow over the later Islamic world. The dominance of the Roman Empire in late antique history is answered by a near total neglect of the peoples of Inner Asia, and I wanted to remedy this neglect. Those peoples, the Kushans, the Kidderite and Hephlite Huns, the Tuoba, the Ruran, the Turks, had political, military, and commercial goals which made deep impressions on the Iranian and Roman states alike. So I wanted to tell their stories as best I could, and portray them as something other than demons, forces of nature, or an inexplicable succession of barbarians, as is often the case, unfortunately, even in some modern scholarship. Something similar may be said for China, which also had important relations with Iran, and so I was eager to situate the Sassanian state within the whole tableau of late antique Eurasia. Finally, the history of Sassanian Iran poses a singular historiographical problem which I wanted to help resolve. The problem is that hardly any contemporary Iranian sources have survived, or at least contemporary literary sources. And so historians have usually relied on contemporary Roman historians and posthumous universal histories written in Arabic from the Islamic era, which purport to recycle Sassanian material. Neither group of sources is entirely trustworthy. But instead of trying to reconcile antithetical traditions, I set out to emphasize contemporary sources, often Armenian and Syriac, and to approach hostile and triumphalist Roman and Arabic accounts with skepticism. But I have not simply rehearsed in my own words what I found in my sources. But analysis, however rigorous it may be, still leaves dark patches. These I tried to fill in with all the modern scholarship available to me and my own inferences. I hope that others may learn something new and continue telling the story. The Sassanian state was founded in the early 3rd century of our era and lasted until the year 651. This is roughly the period that Peter Brown called late antiquity. It coincides with some of the most important events of world history. It coincides, for example, with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity and the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. It coincides with the codification of Christian and Jewish doctrine and with the codification of Roman law. It's a period that saw the migration of the Huns and Germanic peoples and the collapse of Roman power in Western Europe. Perhaps most importantly, this was the time when Muhammad was born, it saw his preaching, the composition of the Quran, and the birth of the religion called Islam. The founder of the Sasanian dynasty was Ardashir, a governor of Fars in southwestern Iran who rebelled and overthrew the incumbent Iranian king. He established the world's first major confessional state. More than a century before the Roman Empire became officially Christian, the Sassanian Empire was Zoroastrian. But when Rome turned Christian, Western Eurasia was divided between two mutually hostile states with incompatible faiths, a kind of ancient Cold War. Both states claimed universal jurisdiction, and the Sassanian Empire portrayed itself as the only legitimate authority on earth. The title of my book, The Last Empire of Iran, does not imply that there were no more Iranian empires after the fall of the Sassanian family. The Safavid and Qajar states of more recent ages were indeed empires. But they were not ostensible revivals of the ancient Iranian homeland described in Zoroastrian scripture. The prophet Zoroaster traced political and religious order to a place that he called the Aryanam Vayejo, which can be translated as the abode of the Aryans. I believe that the dominion of the Sassanian kings, or Iran Shahr as they called it, was named after that mythical ancestral homeland of the Iranian people. The new empire was to be its spiritual and political continuation. It's possible that the Sassanian family had not made the first attempt at such a revival, but theirs was the last. But the late antique empire of Iran was last in another sense also. The Sassanian state was the final and complete form of an ancient imperial vision which originated under the Achaemenid monarchy established by Cyrus the Great, the first Iranian empire. This was the vision of a great sedentary state uniting all the civilized peoples of the earth within a single polity, or at least all the great river civilizations of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Oxus and Jaxartes, and the Indus. This vision inspired the conquests of the Macedonian Alexander the Great, who overthrew that empire. It may even have inspired the unification of China under the short-lived tyranny of the first Qin emperor. But the successors to Alexander who ruled Iran were gradually overrun and their territories were swallowed up by the new Parthian Empire, a loosely organized state of Iranian nomadic origin, which held together much of the old Achaemenid territories for nearly 500 years. And it was the last Parthian king whom Ardashir overthrew and supplanted. The 10th century historian Tabari claims that Ardashir traced his lineage through a series of hereditary guardians of a local Zoroastrian temple back to a mysterious ancestor called Sasan. But contemporary Roman and Armenian sources know nothing of Ardashir's origins, and not even the great rock-hewn inscription of Ardashir's son Shapur corroborates the later account. So there are good reasons to doubt it. Wherever Ardashir and his family came from, his rebellion was the beginning of the so-called Sassanian state, and he established the most centralized and ideologically coherent form of that ancient imperial ideal which originated under Cyrus and his successors. Nevertheless, the Sassanian state owed much to its Parthian predecessor, especially its foreign policy and territorial ambitions. Parthian kings had sometimes claimed that they were descended from both the legitimate kings of the Achaemenid line and the Macedonian conquerors of Iran. Alexander's general Seleucus, who inherited most of the old Achaemenid state, is said to have married an Iranian princess, so the claim is not entirely impossible. However that may be, the genealogy implied that a considerable amount of territory belonged rightfully to the Parthian monarch. But Rome's defeat of Carthage and its steady expansion eastward meant that those lands were increasingly held by a hostile power. Tacitus says that the first century Parthian king Artaban II announced to the Romans that he intended to restore the borders of the ancient Persian and Macedonian empires, and that he would seize all lands held first by Cyrus and afterward by Alexander. The Roman historians Cassius Dio, Herodian, and Ammianus report that much the same policy was asserted by Ardashir and his successors. Older scholarship portrayed the Sassanian state as a sparsely populated, loosely organized, quasi-feudal Asiatic despotism. This idea is absurd and completely wrong. Evidence of Sassanian coins and the investment in agricultural and military infrastructure suggest a highly organized, centralized state. The Sassanian silver dram, for example, maintained its purity, a consistent level of purity, for more than 400 years, whereas the Roman coinage was repeatedly debased. Similarly, no Roman parallel can be found for the enormous expenditure on agricultural infrastructure, canals and so forth, in the lowlands of Iraq, in and around the Sassanian capital. The enormous wall at Gorgan, for example, to the east of the Caspian Sea, also shows considerable power for bureaucratic organization, and puts Sassanian engineers on a par with those of Imperial China. So it's no surprise that the Sassanian state was often more than a match for Rome, and several Roman armies were destroyed in the wars provoked by the first two Sassanian kings. One Roman emperor, Valerian, was even captured and supposedly skinned, taxidermied, and put on display in order to intimidate Roman embassies. After that, a state of war prevailed virtually uninterrupted until the Arab conquests in the 7th century. Fighting took place along an ill-defined frontier running south from the Caucasus down into northern Arabia. A sort of ancient great game took shape, and the principal victim was Armenia, an ancient kingdom culturally Iranian, but with a growing Christian elite that exhibited Roman sympathies. The two powers refused to respect Armenia's autonomy and eventually settled on partitioning it between them. In practically every major conflict thereafter, Armenia served either as battleground or invasion route, roughly akin to Poland or Belgium in more recent times. As time went on, the contest along the Roman frontier worsened and spread southward into Arabia and Ethiopia, with Iran and the Romans contesting control of the India trade that passed through the Red Sea. Unable to break the Persian monopoly, the 6th century Emperor Justinian and his Byzantine successors tried to dominate the overland silk trade from China. This had disastrous consequences when the Turks of Inner Asia, perhaps with Roman backing, aimed to disrupt the Persian economy by flooding Iranian markets with endless rolls of cheap silk, which rival Chinese dynasties had provided them as tribute. A long war resulted at the end of the 6th century, in which Iran fought Roman and Turkish armies on multiple fronts. Although Iran emerged victorious, the monarchy came under great strain, and a rebellion broke out. A high-ranking general named Bahram claimed the throne, and the son of the former Sassanian king, Hormazd, fled to Roman territory seeking an intervention against the usurper. The Romans obliged and overthrew the rebel general, when in turn a rebellion broke out from within the Roman military, and the Roman emperor was overthrown. The Persian king saw his opportunity to invade and annex the Roman state once and for all. That king was Khosrow II, a gigantic figure of world history, and the ensuing conflict was one of the most consequential of all time. The war, fought from the year 602 to 628, was widely believed to be ushering in the end of the world. An impressive number of Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian apocalyptic texts survive from that period. The conflict was portrayed by both sides as a cosmic struggle between Christianity and Zoroastrianism, the outcome of which would bring on the last age before the coming of their respective saviors. There were many instances of destruction, but the Persian capture of Jerusalem in the year 614 stands out as an exemplary act of terror and violence. The relics of the True Cross were captured and sent to Persia as a trophy of war and a gift for Khosrow's Christian wife. The Roman world was shaken to its foundations, just as it had been by the sacking of the city of Rome in the year 410. St. Augustine's utopian visions, which he recorded in his book, The City of God, were conjured up by the shock of Rome's fall. Those were paralleled by prophecies of the end of the world and calls to repentance by Roman churchmen who endured the fall of Jerusalem and the Persian advance.
غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم
But there is no more arresting reflection on that grim time than the earliest portions of the Quran, which were composed during the last great war between Rome and Persia. It took some time for Muhammad's prediction of a Roman victory to come true. After Jerusalem had been subdued, the armies of Iran pushed on into Egypt and Anatolia. The Roman Senate sent a groveling letter urging the Persian king Khosrow II to install a new emperor of his choosing and leave what remained of the empire in peace. Khosrow refused and resolved to liquidate the Roman state once and for all. The armies of Iran and her nomadic allies were to descend upon the Roman capital at Constantinople, besiege it, and receive the emperor's surrender. At this moment, King Khosrow II would have had every reason to look forward to snuffing out his great Western rival. For a moment, the extinction of 800 years of Roman rule in the Mediterranean world hung in the balance. Khosrow's authority now stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates and from the Tigris to the Indus and was about to be extended into Europe. Like his Persian forebears Cyrus and Darius, he commissioned monumental rock reliefs to commemorate his conquests. His vast empire might have lasted for centuries, binding together the fringes of Europe with North Africa and the Levant, with the Iranian plateau, and connecting them all with the world of the Asiatic steppe, and perhaps even with India and China. For the first time in history, the most civilized peoples of Western Eurasia might have constituted a single polity. But this is not how real history unfolded. The Roman Emperor Heraclius led a counterattack through Armenia and took the fight toward the Persian capital of Ctesiphon in Mesopotamia. A Roman alliance with the Turkish nomads of Inner Asia brought the foremost military power of the age into the war, and the Turks destroyed the Iranian border defenses of the Caucasus. These defeats put the reign of Khosrow II under enormous strain. On the night of 28 February 628, Khosrow's own son led a cabal of nobles to overthrow him and make peace with Rome. But not even this settlement lasted. The tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, inspired by a new religion, embarked upon a project of world conquest. In less than a generation, the entire Iranian Empire had fallen, and only the Roman rump state, which we call Byzantium, remained of the old binary world order. The future belonged to the Arab caliphs ruling amidst the ruins of the Greco-Roman and Iranian civilizations. Of course, Sassanian history is not merely a chronicle of warfare with Rome. The two sides were sometimes capable of cooperation. In the early 5th century, the two sides put aside their differences in the face of a common threat from the nomads of Inner Asia. This is an interesting example of how sometimes distant events can reverberate in ways that are unpredictable. And to understand this particular moment in history, we have to cast our gaze back in time and far away to the borderlands of China. 1,000 years before Attila was terrorizing the Roman Empire, his ferocious ancestors were already considered enemies of civilization. The origin of the Huns, whom the Chinese called Xiongnu, was in the high steppe of the Ordos region of Inner Mongolia, which is surrounded on 3 sides by the Great Bend of the Yellow River. The Chinese historian Sima Qian situates the first certain appearance of the Huns, or at least their distant ancestors, 771 years before our era. Raids launched from the Ordos region are said to have ended in the destruction of the Zhou capital at Haojing. After that, the Huns spread terror throughout China until the armies of the first Qin emperor expelled them from the Ordos region. Earlier Chinese kingdoms had attempted to block the advance of nomads by means of ramparts and watchtowers. The Qin state connected and strengthened those fortifications into a vast defensive system, and this was the origin of the so-called Great Wall. When the Qin state collapsed in the 3rd century BC, the Huns returned to the Ordos region. The Han state arose upon the ruins of the Qin, and at about the same moment, the Han king Modu forced the Han to pay an annual tribute. In place of generals, the Han sent their daughters into the steppe, and successive marriage alliances suggested the parity of 2 mutually hostile states. Modu led the westward expansion of the Huns into the Tarim Basin in what the Chinese now call Xinjiang, and his conquests united nearly all Inner Asia within a single nomadic confederacy. Not long after this, internal feuds began to disrupt the Han state, and with time, the Huns were divided into a northern and a southern faction. A series of humiliations inflicted by the armies of the Han Emperor Wu Di and assaults by other nomads deprived the northern Huns of an empire. The Han occupied the Gansu corridor and seized control of the trade routes around the Taklamakan Desert. The northern Huns were then beaten back and confined within the region of the Altai Mountains, and their former subjects, known as the Xianbei, defeated them. The fortune of the southern Huns was different. In the middle of the 1st century of our era, the leader of the southern Huns was a man by the name of Bi. Bi and the 8 hordes that he commanded submitted themselves to the Han Emperor Guangwu. Like the Germanic federates who guarded the outer limits of the Roman Empire, the southern Huns were recruited by the Han to defend their northern frontier, and Bi's son was kept as a hostage at Luoyang. A century and a half later, when Ardashir I had established himself as sole ruler of Iran, the Han state dissolved into 3 mutually hostile kingdoms. One of these kingdoms was established by a military dictator known as Cao Cao. Fearing the power of the Huns, he separated them into 5 divisions over which he placed Chinese superintendents. He detained the leader of the Han federates within the Chinese capital at Luoyang, and employed some of them in his efforts to reunite the fragments of the Han Empire, but he failed. And the reunification of China was achieved by the short-lived Jin dynasty. Toward the end of the 3rd century, the Jin Empire in its turn succumbed to civil war, and the Han federates advanced ever further southward below the Great Wall. Suddenly, Liu Yuan, a descendant of Modu, who lived at Luoyang, declared his independence from the authority of the Jin and announced himself as the legitimate continuator of the Han dynasty. One of his distant ancestors had been a Han princess, apparently. Liu Yuan's son and successor, Liu Cong, who has been called the Chinese Attila, humiliated Jin China by sacking and burning the capitals at Luoyang and Chang'an at the beginning of the 4th century. He captured 2 Jin emperors, forced them to be his butlers, and then executed them. But the Han state established by Liu Cong soon fell apart. Chinese revenge followed. In the year 350, the Chinese general Ran Min seized power and commanded the murder of all foreigners within China. His purpose was to destroy the Huns and their allies, but anyone with a high nose and a full beard was murdered, apparently. It was a genocide, in which at least 200,000 people were killed. The southern Huns who managed to survive then fled, but they could not follow their northern cousins to the Altai. Modern climatological studies suggest the Altai was uninhabitable at that time, so they moved southwest, and some appeared upon the eastern borders of Iran when the armies of Shapur were engaged in an indecisive war against the Romans in the mid-4th century, and others carried on westward, where they were to resurface eventually under the leadership of Attila. 10 years of fighting and diplomatic engagement with the Huns passed before Shapur II returned to the west with the Huns as his ally. The role they played in the Roman war is described in somewhat fanciful detail by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. But this alliance was short-lived. The Sassanian state had probably expected the Huns to guard the eastern borders of Iran, where the civilized world passed into the strange abode of the nomad in the steppe. But the Huns, who were ruled by 2 major dynasties called Kidderite and Hephthalite, soon became a serious threat. The Iranian idea of universal monarchy barely survived conflict with the Huns. The 2 powers were afflicted by them at exactly the same time, and much the same sort of tributary condition that the Huns had forced upon China was forced upon Iran. They had to pay tribute, and this was considered humiliating. The 2 powers were forced to acknowledge that the nomads of Inner Asia were far more dangerous to Rome and Iran than either was to the other. And in the end, they were forced to acknowledge one another as equals. This was the context in which the Sassanian state also adopted a policy of official toleration in regard to Christianity, and allowed the establishment of an indigenous church in imitation of the Roman model. Like Constantine the Great and his successors, King Yasgard I summoned a church council in the year 410 at the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. He declared, "East and West are one dominion under the power of my monarchy," and the canons of that church council still survive. With time, the relationship between the Sasanian king and his Christian subjects became so close that some kings were rumored to have converted. Of course, the Sassanian state never really relinquished the claim to universal jurisdiction despite the strain that it came under. Neither did Rome. But in diplomatic exchanges, the two powers acknowledged one another as partners in the struggle to restrain the northern barbarians. Yet the nomads of Inner Asia posed a far greater threat to Iran than they did to Rome. Northern and eastern Iran abutted the Asiatic steppe directly, and there were few natural defenses against invasion. Hence, the massive Gorgan Wall and other fortifications in the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. Fighting along Iran's eastern frontier was extraordinarily dangerous. Successive Sassanian kings were defeated by the Huns and forced to pay tribute. In the year 484, the Persian king Peruz I was killed on campaign, and most of the Sassanian army was destroyed. This disastrous defeat provoked a crisis of succession and touched off more than a decade of unrest, during which time a renegade Zoroastrian priest named Mazdak became an influential figure. Mazdak preached common ownership of possessions and women, apparently. He eventually fell out of favor, and Khosrow I had him executed in the 520s. But Mazdakism lived on and influenced Islamic mystical sects well into the Middle Ages. Soviet scholars, who were enamored of Mazdak's proto-communism, also took up the cause and tended to extol Mazdakism above any other aspect of Iranian history. To this day, the Sassanian Empire's recovery in the 6th century under Khosrow I and II is remembered as Iran's ancient heyday. Reforms of the military, the tax system, and agriculture put the empire on a firmer footing. Public revenues increased and agricultural production peaked. The tax reform attributed to Khosrow I notably formed the basis of the later Arab Empire's tax policy. A cultural program sponsored by Khosrow I seems to have included the creation of an official dynastic history of Iran, a document that is now lost, but which may have been recycled in later Persian and Arabic histories. These improvements unfolded amidst grim circumstances. Warfare with Rome filled nearly the entire 6th century, and the 540s saw the outbreak of one of the worst pandemics in recorded history, one that seems to have been caused by the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. Both the Roman Emperor Justinian and Khosrow I survived the plague after contracting it personally. It's very difficult to assess how bad the damage really was, but our own experience of a pandemic suggests that even a small death toll could have been extremely disruptive. The two empires were never really the same after that, and it may have been the plague that left them somewhat more vulnerable to the later Arab invasion, Arabia having been relatively untouched by the plague. The Arab conquerors in the middle of the 7th century were surely astounded at how quickly they had overthrown the Sassanian monarchy. The last king, Yasgard III, fled for his life, attempting to escape into the Asiatic steppe, but was intercepted and killed. Much of his family and a few surviving aristocrats managed to flee to China, where they were welcomed by the Tang Emperor at Chang'an. There, for about 200 years, a Sassanian court in exile was maintained, and several unsuccessful attempts were made to reconquer the empire. The Umayyad clan was the first Arabian dynasty to rule Iran. For nearly a century, it reigned from Damascus, attempting to enforce authority over the old Sassanian Empire. 50,000 Arabian troops stationed at the garrison city of Marv in eastern Iran took Persian wives and began adopting Iranian cultural practices. In 750, those troops rose in revolt and overthrew the Umayyads. The new dynasty, known to posterity as Abbasid, established their capital in Baghdad, only about 20 miles from the old Sassanian capital at Ctesiphon. Their civil administration imitated the customs of the Sassanian chancery, and a new generation of Iranian functionaries arose in service to the new empire, which took on an Iranian identity, The successors to Muhammad were instructed and edified by volumes of Persian wisdom literature, treatises on Iranian courtly manners and the history of the Sassanians. The heritage of the Sassanian era, its literature, architecture, metalworking, glassware, carpets, and textiles, inspired subsequent medieval Persianic culture and became part of the foundation of classical Islamic civilization. There had been bitter resistance and rebellion in some parts of Iran. The authority of the Caliph sat lightly upon the more remote regions of the old Sassanian Empire. At the beginning of the Abbasid Revolution, there were at least 2 attempts to overthrow the Arabs and re-establish an indigenous Zoroastrian monarchy, but they failed. It was only in the 9th century, as the Abbasid Caliphate declined, that indigenous Iranian dynasties began to assert themselves again. But there would never be a Persian Justinian to reconquer his ancient patrimony. No Iranian Charlemagne would ever revive the religion and monarchy of Ardashir, and there were no Zoroastrian monasteries to copy and preserve the literary heritage of Iran. Most of the high aristocracy of Iran had perished in battle or had fled to China with the sons of Yazgar III. So it fell to the landed gentry who had arisen in Sasanian times to preserve and transmit the lore of Iran to successive generations of Iranian Muslims. Local gentry survived in no other part of the Islamic Empire, for the great families of Roman Syria and Egypt disappeared in the early 7th century, never to return. Only in Iran did such aristocrats look back with defiant pride upon their Zoroastrian ancestors and boast of the achievements of their ancient kings and heroes. Caesar, Constantine, and Justinian were nothing but names to the Arabs, and their reigns were forgotten. But ancient Iranian mythology and the memory of the Sassanian kings were faithfully remembered, most famously by the 11th century poet Ferdowsi in his Shahnameh, also known as the Iranian national epic. The survival of the Persian language in which the Shahnameh was composed would have seemed doubtful at first. The Coptic, Aramaic, and Greek languages nearly died out in the Arab Empire, and the modern citizens of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq mostly speak Arabic and call themselves Arabs. But the Persian language has survived. Though Islam steadily spread throughout Iran with time, the indigenous population refused any other form of assimilation. The Sassanian Empire lost the battle, but won the war. Nabigha al-Ja'di, an early Islamic poet, marveled that the old Iranian Empire had been destroyed so quickly, as though it had been nothing but a dream. But the truth is that though the empire was gone, the dream never died. In fact, it could be said that instead of assimilating Iran, the Arabs and Islam were assimilated by Iran. The Sassanian heritage was to the Islamic Golden Age as Greco-Roman culture was to the European Renaissance, the key difference being that Sassanian culture was revived after a much shorter interval. Much of what we think of as Islamic architecture and visual art have no Arabian precedents. They are, like the huge vaulted porticos and pointed arches of Bukhara, of Sassanian inspiration. The mosaics within the Dome of the Rock, for instance, borrow Sassanian images and even depict the same wings of victory visible on the coins of Khosrow II and which appear on the modern logo of the University of Tehran. So-called Islamic carpets, glassware, metalworking, music, astrology, all of these were inspired, at least in part, by Sassanian models also. In the end, most of the sedentary Near East was united not by the state that claimed to be descended from the mythical abode of the Aryans, but by the successors to the Prophet Muhammad. Nowadays, the failure of Marxism, political Islam, and the Arab Spring movement may make it hard for us to see the Middle East as anything other than a war-torn, violent place ruled by dictators and strongmen and clerics. But perhaps the history of ancient Iran can make us see it differently.